Cool. So with that, again, welcome to today's session of the Tennessee Harm Reduction Project ECHO. Today's topic is holding space, harm reduction approaches to death and grief. So today, per usual, we'll have our didactic presentation followed by a scenario presentation and Q&A. We'll be using the chat if you would like to ask questions or engage that way, or we'll also have Menti, which is anonymous. Next slide. Our speaker today is Sam Kocher, who has worked in harm reduction for the past 6 years in both rural and urban settings in East Tennessee. They completed death doula training in July and are excited to use their skills to support people who use drugs as well as other harm reductionists. So everybody, please welcome Sam. And Sam, just let Allie know when you would like to advance the slide.
All right, sounds good. Thank you guys for having me today.
Absolutely.
All right. We're gonna go ahead and just jump right in. This presentation is not going to have all of the answers to how to grieve or how to talk about death, but hopefully y'all will leave here with some tools that you'll find useful. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to start with just a few disclaimers. First of all, there's no right or wrong way to grieve or process a loss or a death or a traumatic experience. And I think that's just something that's really important to foreground in this conversation. I'm also not an expert on all things death related. Just because I went to a training doesn't necessarily mean that I know more than everyone in this room. And I think it's something that, at least for me, it feels really important to approach with a lifelong learning mindset. I also can talk about this forever. And so if any of y'all want to continue the conversation after this, my email is at the end of the presentation, and I would love to talk to you guys. And I think most importantly, talking about death and grief can bring up a lot of stuff for folks. And so I just want you all to remember that it can be challenging to talk about and be gentle with yourselves. All right, next slide, please. So what is a death doula? I think this is something that a lot of folks are maybe hearing more now. But essentially what the role of a death doula is to be someone who is not a medical professional. There are death doulas who are medical professionals, but who isn't necessarily trained medically, but can help support a person and their circle of support or support network through the process of dying. And that means that death doulas can really work with anybody, healthy people, people who know that they're dying, their loved ones after a death. So there are lots of ways that people doing this work are able to sort of step in and support folks. Next slide. And so there are some guiding principles that are sort of part of kind of the death doula like code of ethics, if you will. And really, those are just, like I said, providing non-medical support, being non-judgmental of folks, really trying to respect their autonomy, having a family or community-centered approach. I try to be really intentional with the way that I talk about family, because for a lot of folks, that's chosen family and friends, not necessarily biological family. And so I just want to highlight that. Holistic care, so really viewing a person as a whole person and recognizing that there are lots of factors that influence the way that people move through the world. Being empowering of people and the decisions that they're interested in making, and really just being a member of that person's team, right? Showing up for them and being consistent. And I think as I talked about those things, I hope for some of you all, there's some pretty apparent overlap with the way that we think about harm reduction, working in certain service programs, showing up for folks who use drugs as well. Next slide, please. I talked about this a little bit, but I think in addition to having similar ethics and goals for the folks that death doulas work with, harm reduction programs often serve as a primary hub for healthcare and access to referrals and resources for people who use drugs. Lots of the folks that we see, I work in a harm reduction program, an SSP. Lots of the folks that we see are folks who maybe aren't able to or choose not to engage in other types of programs or other resources because they've had negative experiences in the past, and we can work to provide like a buffer or like provide warm handoffs and things like that. And so harm reduction programs provide an opportunity to offer that for people in the context of death and dying and all of the things associated with that. We can also try, as much as we're comfortable, as much as we have the capacity to try to fill gaps, right? Like, I think a lot of us just do that every day. When people come to us and ask us questions, if we don't know the answers, I think a lot of us are constantly trying to learn and grow and find out new things. And so I think this is another place where we're able to do that. And I think it goes probably without saying, but I think it's really important to highlight the fact that grief is something that impacts harm reduction program participants and harm reduction program staff in many, many ways. And those ways overlap between both groups. Next slide. So what does grief look like for participants? I listed some stuff. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's just some stuff that I wanted to highlight. So for a lot of the folks that come to harm reduction programs, they're folks who trying to survive, right? Like they're navigating a bunch of different types of instability a lot of times. Housing instability, food insecurity, lots and lots of structures that they're having to navigate. And so for a lot of folks at a baseline, they don't really have the time or space to process or feel grief. And something that we know about grief is that if people don't have the time or space to feel it, that's when it becomes like traumatic grief, right? That's when it sort of compounds and shows up in ways that are detrimental to a person's health. And so if we are able to provide an outlet for people, even if that's, checking in with someone, a lot of SSPs will ask people if they've used naloxone recently. And there's a study that showed that a lot of times programs, because they're sort of pushed to like the limits of their capacity and things like that, don't necessarily follow up with that person and say, so you used naloxone, how did that make you feel? And just that extra step of saying, hey, like, I see that you used this and that's great. I'm really glad you had it. And also, let's take a second to acknowledge that, like, that's hard for you to do. Even something as small as that or seemingly small as that can have a huge impact on participants. Lots of our participants are experiencing ongoing trauma and losses. We often see people who come into the harm reduction program and share that their loved ones have recently died, or honestly, we hear people share that people they don't really know died, but that still touches them, and I think that's really important as well. Lots of participants share fear for themselves and their community. A little bit of anticipatory grief, right? Like thinking about what might happen if my loved one gets a bad batch or loses their tolerance or something like that and overdoses. So there's a lot of anxiety around that as well. It's also really hard to navigate the funeral industry. It's really hard to navigate accessing therapy and support if someone is grieving. And in addition to the lack of knowledge and just the challenging ways that that's set up, that stuff can also be incredibly expensive. We're going to talk in a couple of slides about some ways that we can support people around that. But really trying to recognize the financial barriers around death care as well is very important. Lots of times folks who are in community with other people who use drugs are excluded from memorial services especially when the family of a person who died is planning that memorial. And so I think that something we can do is try to hold space for people to grieve if they're not able to attend a memorial. Because I think that that sort of limits the ways that people can experience closure. Feelings of helplessness. So a lot of times if people don't have naloxone, there can be feelings of guilt if their friend overdoses. Feelings of helplessness more generally, if someone dies and it's not drug related, it's really hard to not feel like you could have controlled that situation. And then also like feelings of helplessness around structural things, like if a person were to, not have a place to stay and freeze to death or something like that. So there are lots of ways that structurally people can feel really helpless and like there's not something tangible for them to hold on to around grief. People can use more chaotically if they're experiencing grief, and so being mindful of that as well. People can become isolated if they're grieving, especially if they are not able to express those big feelings in their community. And then we also come up against the question of sometimes people who die don't have biological family, and their community members don't necessarily realize that anyone can be next of kin. Like, and so just recognizing that like there's some nuance and we can sort of be a liaison for that person to figure out, like what their rights are and stuff like that around people that they care about dying. Next slide, please. And then how can grief look for us as workers? I think that I've experienced all of these things in the 6 years that I've been working at a certain service program. I don't want to speak for all of you here, but I think if you're doing this work, you've probably been touched by at least maybe one or two of these. And so like I said, these things overlap a lot with the things that that our participants are experiencing too. So things like lack of closure. Sometimes we don't know if someone's died, right? I think that's one of the things that can be incredibly challenging in this work is if you're working, in an anonymous program, you see someone every week for years, and then all of a sudden they stop coming in. It can be really hard to not assume the worst. If someone does die, you don't always necessarily hear about it. Sometimes community members will share that they've heard, so-and-so has died. But that doesn't necessarily always happen. And so there can be a huge lack of closure. We also, as people who are working in this field, aren't necessarily folks who are going to be attending funerals or memorials. And so there's also a lack of closure in that regard as well. We also can experience anticipatory grief, fear that our participants are going to die, especially when we see waves of overdoses, which I think many of us have experienced. That can be really challenging and can lead us to sort of just carry this like deep worry within us. And so that can be really challenging to navigate. Death can also lead us to think about our own mortality, which can be really challenging. And so being mindful of that as we move through this work as well. I think also there's a lot of pressure to try to remain professional for our participants, which I think is very important. Boundaries are important. However, I think it's also sometimes detrimental to our well-being to feel like even when we're not in a space where we can't express our emotions, like that we like don't let ourselves cry if someone died or something like that, right? And so finding spaces where you can sort of not necessarily when you're providing direct services to your participants, but maybe when you're with your team, taking a moment to like actually give yourself that time to collectively feel, because like losing people is really heavy. And I think it's important to remember that like even though they're professional relationships that we have with our participants, they're still often pretty deep relationships, especially when it's folks that we've known for years and years. A lot of times I think we try to shove our grief in a box and think that we can just leave that at the office and it won't pop up in other places in our lives. And we all know that's not true. That's not how that works. It would be really cool if we could, but that's just not how grief happens. And that can, again, the same way that it can be harmful to our participants, it can pop up in having impacts on your mental health or your physical health, your relationships, things like that. And then feelings of helplessness and isolation, again, especially as people doing this work, I think we often are able to see patterns in the way that our communities are impacted by things like laws, things like various like bad batches, things like that. And so it's really challenging sometimes to see those patterns and not be able to do anything from the position that we're in to immediately change those things. And so I think just a lot of acknowledgement of these challenges is really big. Next slide, please. And I want to highlight this quote. It's from Barbara Carnes, who is a hospice nurse. And she's written some really great pamphlets that are incredibly accessible. And she says, we need to understand grief is a normal, natural reaction to the loss of someone or something. Each of us is going to handle our grief in our own way, just like we handle any other emotion. And I really like this. I think it's important to remember that grief looks a bunch of different ways and to just feel open to that. Next slide. So this is the part that I hope is helpful for at least someone on this call. What can we do to support our participants? So I think at a very, very baseline thing that we can do is give our participants space to guide discussion and share what they're comfortable sharing. Obviously, it's going to be harmful in a different way if we're forcing people to tell us how they're feeling. But just continually offering those spaces for people to share what they're going through can have huge impacts on participants, and give them a space that they maybe don't have somewhere else. Because sometimes people can experience what's called disenfranchised grief, or grief that's minimized either by themselves or others based on the way that someone has died or what that traumatic experience may have looked like. And so really just validating that is huge. Another thing that programs can do to support participants is offering space for memorials. So that can look a lot of ways as well. Things that I know other programs have done, our program has tried to do, is offer things like an altar where people can put items that were important to them or that person, so that the community can kind of witness that that person, was here, and that there's a piece of their legacy, right? Having a bulletin board where people can put things like art or even just little notes can be pretty meaningful. Giving people space to create art as well. Those are all ways that we can provide opportunities for memorialization. Offering things like grief support groups or sharing circles where participants are able to be really vulnerable and find community with other people who are experiencing grief as well. And then some of these are a little bit more in depth. And I know not every program necessarily has the capacity to do this, and that's okay. But I wanted to put these out there as ways that people might engage. And so it's possible for programs to do things like discuss basic end of life planning with participants. A lot of times I think we spend time thinking about specifically overdose death, but everyone dies at some point. And so having things like knowledge about advanced directives, healthcare proxies, and hospital visitation forms can help make it so that if anything happens to someone, there's a little bit of support and preparation to make that easier for that person's circle of support. It's also just really helpful, I think, for people to take a little time to think about death. I know we don't like to do that culturally because it's scary and it raises a lot of hard questions. But just taking that first step and thinking about it can be really huge and can kind of demystify and make that whole experience less scary for people. Um, as programs, we can also take a little bit of time to research what local death care resources look like. And so that can be finding funeral directors in the community that you can help link someone to should they need them. Again, whether it's overdose related, whether it's, their Nana died. There are lots of ways that people are touched by death and grief. Um, and if you're able to, having a relationship with a funeral director where you're able to say, okay, this person's going to be nice to you because we know just the way that any other referral might look, being able to kind of gear people up for what that encounter is going to look like can be really meaningful. Finding spiritual and or secular leaders in your community who might be open to hosting memorials, that can be really huge, especially for folks who might not be able to be part of a formal memorial with a decedent's family. That can be really huge. Recognizing that sometimes there are local resources for helping with the cost of funerals and things like that. So when I was researching this, I'm not a Nashville person, but I learned that in Nashville, there's actually a program that will help pay for people's funerals, which I thought was really cool. And like it's very open. It seems like it's very easy to access. So even just knowing about, if there's something like that in your community, I don't think a lot of communities have resources like that. I think that's a really special exception. But just taking a minute and just Googling like funeral assistance can go a long way. Helping people navigate things like unclaimed persons lists. In Knox County, for example, the Forensic Center has a list of people who have died who no one has claimed. Um, and in our program, we've had people approach us to say, hey, what does that mean? Like someone I know is on that list. And being able to help people navigate that so that that person isn't necessarily interred in a place that they wouldn't have wanted to be. And then things like getting people connected to legal aid to help with things like probate and things like that can be really beneficial as well. Next slide. And so what can we do for and with each other as people who are working in harm reduction? So I think at a baseline, being willing to talk about death and not avoid it. Don't use euphemisms when you can. Try to avoid like passed away or things like that. I understand the urge. I've done it. I've probably done it in this presentation, honestly. But the more that we name and acknowledge death, the more that we normalize it. And that can be really huge. Having referral lists can be really beneficial for people that we work with in addition to our participants. Because again, people are touched by death in a lot of different ways. And so knowing if there are grief groups, if there are, any number of resources related to this stuff. Also, if employers are able to offer things like employee assistance programs so that if someone is experiencing grief, whether it's related to the work that they're doing or not, that can be really meaningful. Collaborating with other mental health providers to maybe have grief counselors come into the office can be really useful. Something that's kind of growing among more like corporate entities is actually support programs for people to access death doula services. And what that means is if someone wants to do end of life planning, they can reach out to their HR and their HR will pay for them to meet with a death doula and talk about that. And so that's another place where we can kind of normalize this stuff. Death doulas also can help people navigate grief and just sort of be present with that person as well. And so there's lots of ways that that could be beneficial. And then the final 3 bullets are, I think, all sort of linked. Cross-training staff and having robust bereavement policies so that people are able to take time off and not feel guilty for doing so if they need to. Making it so that if someone's overwhelmed in a space, they can step away. Having those things in place is huge. And then working to build in ritual memorialization and connection into our work. Just because we're professionals doesn't mean that we can't take a little bit of time to feel our feelings as well. And I know that for many people, that sounds really corny. And I think if you were to ask me a year ago, I would maybe be one of those people. But I think that I think it's really important to take the time to do that. Because I know for me, it makes doing this work feel um, a lot more fulfilling and a lot less alienating. Next slide. And this is not exhaustive, but this is a list of examples of ways that ritual might show up, things that people can do, building altars, creating something. It doesn't have to be quote unquote good art, right? It's not necessarily like you're gonna show it to anyone, but the process of creating can be really great and really healing for people. Grounding and embodiment, meditation. This one's a little silly, but I kind of like it. Screaming into a pillow. If you're like really overwhelmed and you scream into a pillow, that can be really satisfying. And then some things for like larger community, holding things like candlelight vigils or memorial events. International Overdose Awareness Day is a huge one for a lot of people. But there are lots of ways that we can find community and find ways to acknowledge that like in this work there's a lot of like beauty and a lot of love and there can be a lot of pain and those things don't have to exist separate from one another. Next slide. There's also some more generalized resources. I wanted to highlight the Dope Project's Grieving Overdose Scene. It's really great. It's kind of a pain to fold if you're not a person who is used to folding zines, especially. But I think it's worth the labor that it takes to fold it. And then Barbara Carnes, the person that I quoted earlier, has a whole series of end of life pamphlets. The one that I really wanted to highlight is called My Friend I Care, The Grief Experience. And it's a really beautiful, uh, you know, walking through of what grief can look like for folks from someone who has spent decades working with grieving and dying people. Next slide. And I wanted to end on this quote because when I read it, it really, really resonated with me. Um, Joy is not the opposite of grief. Grief is the opposite of indifference. And I think for a lot of us, we try to avoid feeling those feelings because it's hard and it's challenging. But I think it's also a really, really beautiful reminder that we care deeply for the folks that we work with and the work that we do. And so that's where I wanted to wrap things up. Next slide. This is just a list of resources. I'm not going to read it to you. You'll get this afterwards. And I just want to say thank you for spending a little bit of time letting me talk to you guys about this today.
Wow, Sam, that was amazing. I feel like I should have done like a disclaimer at the beginning because it was so touching and so moving. And I like you said in your presentation, like death and grief affects all of us in different ways. So I think it was super poignant. And a huge part of harm reduction is like protecting and uplifting other people's dignity and talking about death, which is like both simple and a complex subject. Talking about that in such a compassionate way is like an amazing example of uplifting people's dignity. But in the chat, there's like a myriad of books and resources that people shared. So thank you for sharing that with everybody. But do you all have questions for Sam?
While you guys are thinking of questions, I just want to say I just caught up with the chat. I'm not good at multitasking, and there are some really great book recommendations and like video maker recommendations in the chat. So definitely if you are someone who is interested in that sort of thing, I highly recommend checking it out. Oh,
I have a question
so,
for you.
oh,
Unless you were answering one. Sorry.
I was going to answer one in the chat really quick, but then,
Yeah.
okay. So someone in the chat asked where I got death doula training from. I went through the Going with Grace death doula training. Elua Arthur, who many of you have maybe seen, she's done some TED Talks and like YouTube videos and things. Led the training with some really wonderful facilitators. There are also other death doula trainings that have really wonderful facilitators as well. If any of y'all are interested in that sort of thing, I would be happy to talk with you after this about what the process of undergoing death doula training might look like for you.
I had Sam a question. I know it's not like an exhaustive list earlier. We're talking about things to do and ways to be supportive. And so there may not be a correct answer for this, but like, what is your best answer for how to deal with this? Say you work at an exchange or just anywhere in general, right? And so you're seeing a lot of people in a short amount of time. Someone comes in and you hear about a death or something like that. And obviously, like grief, we want to be able to feel those emotions, stuff like that. But then we also have 50 people behind them in a line to serve or to do other things like that. Or you're in a hospital, you're a medical person, or you're not. Like, so when you don't have adequate time to actually sit with that person or those feelings or that, how do you balance feeling those feelings, processing the grief, as well as taking care of everyone else who's there who isn't related in any way to the situation you're dealing with?
Excuse me, that is a really great question. That's hard. So I think I'm going to start with the how I would handle it for myself and then talk about how I would handle like the situation with the person. Um, I think for me, as someone who is sort of often very like, I need to like complete the task in front of me and then I need to move on to the next task and like I'm oriented like to that. I think I would probably for myself uh do the work of kind of putting that in a container, putting that in a box, and then at the end of the day, or when there's a lull, having a conversation with the people on my team after, to sort of process that for myself, especially if the death is someone that they also knew. I think making sure to communicate that quickly and clearly, and making sure that everyone is sort of on the same page is really important. For that person, that's really challenging. I think it kind of depends on the context. If it's possible to maybe step away with that person, or spend a little bit more time with that person while other people on your team are able to sort of like get through the line, right? Like kind of divide and like, I was gonna say conquer, that doesn't feel like the right word, but like sort of like divide and like complete the task at hand, right? I think that that could be helpful. If that's not possible, because I know it's not always possible, I think I would say trying to like really acknowledge briefly, like, hey, I hear you. I know that like this sounds really heavy. And we're really busy, and like I'm not trying to like push you out the door or anything like that. Um, but also, when you come back next time, let's check in again. Or let me know if there are any resources that you need, like really like giving people that space to say like, hey, I can't show up 100% for you in this precise moment, but why don't we keep having a conversation and keep checking in about this? Because I think a lot of times when we're seeing people who are sharing like that they've experienced a death or something traumatic, they tend to be folks that we see regularly more often because we have those longstanding relationships. And so really trying to like lean into that and keep it going as a conversation rather than um, you know, disregarding their feelings or uh fully putting it on hold and not ever going back to it again. I see Bo in the chat saying that having crew debriefs after bad EMS calls was really useful, and not being forced to go home. I think that's really, really helpful. Sometimes you do just want to be sad at work. Sometimes you want to be sad next door, outside of the space. Sometimes you want to be sad with the people you work with. And so I think too, having like flexibility with the folks that are on your team is really meaningful.
Cool. Thank you, Sam. And Sam shared their email in the slides that will be going out to everyone. So I'm sure like you can continue that conversation, or if you have any more questions, you can contact Sam. But we're going to move on to our scenario presentation because we have a couple, so we want to get to at least a couple.